Welcome. It's just gone 7 p.m, Wednesday, the 9th of March, and you are watching episode 39 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, between now and Net Zero 2050, is my guest, Joe Dobbs. Joe is the founder and president of Bushfire Survivors for Climate Change and was until recently a councillor in the New South Wales Bega Valley Shire. On March 18th, 2018, Joe witnessed the devastating bushfire rip through a small southern coastal township of Tatara, destroying 65 homes and buildings, damaged a further 39 and destroyed 70 caravans and cabins. Fortunately, there was no loss of life of the township of 622 people. Although she didn't lose her home, she saw dozens of her friends and neighbours lose everything. The landscape she was so familiar with altered beyond all recognition. This event left Joe with no doubt that climate change is not a future problem, but is here and now. Joe was propelled into climate action, devoting her time and energy raising the difficult conversations about how climate damage is hurting the communities across Australia and that urgent emissions reductions are the only way to avoid greater catastrophes. She co-founded and now heads Bushfire Survivors for Climate Action. In 2021, the group won a landmark legal case compelling the New South Wales EPA to develop an adequate climate policy and continues to collaborate with the authority on the content of the policies. At the recent Glasgow COP26, Joe broke the story of fossil fuels and fracking mining joint Santos domination of the Australian pavilion. She noted that there was over 500 lobbyists from the fossil fuel sector at the world's most significant climate conference. In recognition of Joe's efforts, she was awarded Emerging Leaders in Climate Action in 2021 at the Women's Agenda Leadership Awards. Joe is currently writing a book about climate change and intergenerational trauma. Welcome, Joe.
Hey, Bill, thanks for having me.
Well, if you can give us a bit of background yourself in regards to, are you a native of the Bega area and your schooling background and how you got to into the area of Bega, and any other sort of anecdotal stories about your youth?
Okay, well, that's I'm trying to think of something where we can go and all the stuff that I shouldn't tell you about myself, but I'm a relative newcomer to the Bega Valley Shire, having been here for just the mere blink of an eye, being 22 years. I came from Victoria originally, was born in regional Victoria in the Wimmera district, which is sort of wheat and sheep farming district there, but was raised in outer urban Melbourne in a very leafy gum tree suburb, Eltham, Montmorency. If anyone of your listeners are familiar with any of Melbourne, they might know that suburb. So I grew up, but in a suburban, average suburban childhood, except that I would go for holidays to my grandparents' dairy farm in Gippsland, and then sometimes go up and visit my uncle and aunt who had wheat and sheep property up in the Mallee. So I did get to see two very different rural and farming agricultural lifestyles, small towns, and having grandparents in those locations and knowing what life was like as intergenerational locals in those places. It was a really important part of my development, and I've always had a soft spot for the country as a result. I loved living in a city when I was younger, in my 20s, but I was always drawn back out to the country and out to those little towns, and that's where kind of my heart lies to this day. So moving to Bega 22 years ago, because I'd met my partner who I'd actually been in high school with many years before that. So kind of re-met this fella, and he was living in this shire here, and at that stage had two fairly small kids, and he was single at that point and had been for quite some time, having the kids on the, alternate weeks sort of situation. And like a fool, I decided I'd move right into the middle of that. And here I am 22 years later, I survived. And so did they.
Well, being your childhood in Melbourne area, but having the ability to go and visit the Wimmera and also Gippsland, they're chalk and cheese. Anyway, people are not familiar, but the Wimmera Mallee is a very dry area, and it can suffer from droughts. And I remember in 1983 was my first trip to Melbourne, posted in there to Victoria Barracks with the Defence Force, and we came through in late January. 2 days later, the Ash Wednesday fires followed us through, and about 2 days after that, the big dust cloud came in off the Mallee and Wimmera, and that is rather a scary fright. You're sitting up 24 floors in a building, and you just see this pool of dust and darkness coming down from Ballarat way from the north, just enveloped Melbourne, and that was pretty scary. And I also had friends down in the Gippsland as well, down past Traralgon, and that was a completely different. That was a boggy place and always had floods, So like you would have got both extremes of weather. Like especially if you went to the Mallee Wimmera in summer and got beaten over the head by the northerly winds. And you went down to the Gippsland in winter and froze to death by the southerly winds. So you would have had experience with different weathers.
Yeah. I guess I was made for this, wasn't I? I hadn't thought about that before, but yeah, when it comes to climate and extremes, I have lived them my whole life. Yeah.
Well, maybe can we just talk about the fire in your area in 2018? Now, I do remember that story. I mean, although up here in Cairns, we did hear about it on the general news and stuff, and there was a lot of information because I go to the internet and read all the New South Wales papers and stuff like that. Now, if you give us your account, but I also understand there was an inquiry into that fire, and there was also a lot of finger pointing between I think it was the rural fire service and the volunteers, or the regular fire service. But it's a bit faded from my memory. But if you can give us the picture in regards to the fire itself, the response, and then maybe the push for the inquiry and the results of that inquiry.
Sure. So just a little sort of bit of storytelling about what I saw on that day. So I was actually out of the valley when the fires started, and 2018 had been a relatively cool and green summer. So I've spoken to a lot of people locally and to a lot of fireys about what their perception of the fire risk was up till that day, and everybody agreed it was not a summer that anyone thought there was going to be a disaster. It was a summer that we were pretty relaxed. There weren't a series of high alerts. There hadn't been any other big fires. There wasn't a sense of threat, and consequently, there wasn't much preparedness.
And it was getting fairly late in the season too.
Yeah, it's the 18th of March is quite late in the season. Usually by then, you're starting to think about getting your firewood in and stacking that somewhere close to the house so you can, get out there on a cold night and grab some firewood and go inside. So we'd reached that end of the summer as well, but it's technically, I think, outside the fire danger period. So there we all are, quite relaxed about, the threats and thinking about other things. And I had been away for a conference for a couple of nights and was driving back to the valley with another counsellor who's now also a good friend. And she's got a brother who heads up one of the emergency services in the valley. And it's her habit, as she comes down the big mountain from the Monero, which is the Monero Plain is sort of in between us and Canberra. And there's a very steep, short mountain, the Brown Mountain, that one has to drive down to get down into the lush Bega Valley. So we were coming off that plain, and there was a rip-roaring wind up there, and it was very hot, which was unusual in itself, but weather can be like that up there. But the weird thing was that as we drove down the mountain, and my friend was checking her fires near me app, because that was her habit, to just see, you know, what was going on. I was driving, she was looking at the app, and she started to say, hey, there are fires starting in the valley. And, you know, that was more of a curiosity than anything at that point. But as we drove down, there was this bizarre phenomenon. Usually as you drive off that plain on a hot day down to the valley, which is coastal, you would expect the temperature to drop, but we're driving the work car. It's got a temperature gauge, and the temperature was going up. We're sitting in the aircon. It was, you know, quite pleasant. But again, my colleagues reading out the news about the fires as we drive down, temperature's getting hotter. The wind is absolutely howling, you know, pushing the car around. And as she named the various fires up and down the valley, she got to a point where she named one just on Reedy Swamp. Now, I live literally on the other side of the hill to Reedy Swamp. And the direction that the wind was blowing, I knew immediately was going to take the fire that had started at that point towards my property and my home. And we live on 50 acres of coastal forest. We've got the Bega River runs not directly next to our property, but there's a lagoon that runs up to the edge of our property. So we've got some water close by, and 2 kilometres away, we can see the bridge over the Bega River, and behind that, the ocean. So we're pretty coastal. And as we came down that mountain, we could see those big columns of smoke in the distance. And for the first time in my life, I realized that one of those columns of smoke was going to be personal. And it's that I had to make that kind of, well, it was, I didn't have to, it was made for me, that switch where you think, this is not about other people. This is actually about me and my home and all of the things in my home and the people I love. I'd rung my partner. He said he was onto it. I heard fear in his voice, and he's not a person who scares easily. So that was very sobering for me. And I left him to it and said I'd meet him in Tathra, because Tathra sounded like a safe place to be in town when there's a fire threatening your property out of town. So we proceeded, drove down the mountain, watched the column of smoke building in the distance, drove through Tathra, saw everybody, you know, so many friends and neighbours standing outside on the roads looking towards that column of smoke. And I remember thinking, oh, there's Jan, she's aware of it, and there's Madeline, she's got her eyes on that. Everybody knows what's going on, and the threat is to my home and my neighbours' homes up on the ridge. And then met my partner, and we stood at that bridge close to the ocean and watched. We could see our home in the distance, and then we watched that column of smoke get bigger and bigger as it came towards us. And what we saw amongst the grey smoke of the forest burning was these columns of black smoke. And columns of black smoke is when a home burns or a car burns, and all of the toxic things in those fires that cause a much different kind of smoke. So it was really clear to us. We could see, and we could kind of plot the course of the fire as it came closer by those columns as we waited to see if our place would be hit. And then the next big shock for me was to see people start to evacuate out of Tathra and come across that bridge that we were on the what we thought was the safe side.
What I might do is just show a map of the area.
Yeah.
So people get a bit of an idea.
So our sleepy little holiday village of Tathra, I live to the northwest of that map. You can see it's quite a small town there, but you can see the forest behind us, and you can.
And you've got the Bega River up to the north and coming around. So you've got the Bega River there. You've got all the coastal there and a nice sandy beach to hide on if you get into real trouble.
Yeah, really.
So where did the fire sort of come from? From the north up here, did it?
Yeah, northwest, and it was literally at the sort of on my road to town, because to get to Bega, I drive in that westerly direction.
I also noticed from the landscape, there's some nice sort of channeling undulations that sort of would be great for making a breeze through and sort of funneling fire too in a lot of this area.
It's interesting what ended up happening, Bill, was a lot of those valleys that are usually and traditionally the wet places where there's ferns and a bit of ground, more ground moisture than usual on the ridges. In the fires that have happened in our valley, more than one now in the last 3 years, what I've observed, and I wasn't sure whether I was just seeing an aberration, but it's become really consistent and really quite frightening, is that the cooler, damp gullies have become places that have functioned like chimneys, and the fires have burned really hot and really torn up those gullies in the sense of movement. And the gullies that would have been safe places in normal or the fires of old are now places that burn hotter than ever before. And that's had a big impact, not just on the vegetation, but any animals that might be taking refuge in those places. And even, I remember fire, kind of basic fire safety stuff as a kid. What you were taught was to get down low somewhere behind a log, get in a low spot like those gullies, but there's no way I would be attempting that these days, because those places just were completely torched.
I suppose the thing is, that's the beauty of today with communications, if used properly, with mobile phones and the warning system. Most people, if they're paying attention, would probably get enough time to make a decision to leave beforehand. And I think we'll probably both agree that's probably the best thing, rather than leaving it too late or trying to sit it out sort of thing.
Totally, Bill. And I can't tell you the number of people, and there's what people have told me since, because I've talked about bushfires for so long now. I've had so many people tell me things that have surprised me hugely, but in a lot of cases also confirmed some thoughts I'd had that I thought, nah, surely not. That can't be. I'm thinking crazy stuff here. But one of the things that I've had said to me several times, enough that it's changed my mind about that concept of staying and fighting a fire, is people saying they stayed, they fought the fire, they saved their house, they saved the neighbors' houses, and they didn't get fire injured themselves, and they would never do it again. It was the wrong decision, because the mental trauma of doing that was so great that they wish they hadn't done it, even though they saved their house as a result. And that has stuck with me so strongly, because we all celebrate those heroes who do that, but we absolutely should not be encouraging people to put themselves in those situations, because even the people who survived are now saying they wish they had not done that. And I think that's a really important point for people to know, is fire behavior has changed so dramatically and escalated so severely that the things we used to do and believe were, reasonable actions are no longer safe and no longer reasonable. And I think all the fire authorities would agree that they would much rather people just left early and planned for this and got out of the way, and certainly didn't put any of those
people in danger.
Exactly, because the last thing you want is people having to go into that danger to try and hook you back out again. So, yeah.
Just moving on to the fire itself. So when did it go from being what sort of watch and wonder to, hey, this is catastrophic. We either need to go and hide on the beach or get out of here or whatever. What was the timescale between standing there and watching until we shouldn't be standing here anymore?
I knew from the minute I got out of the car, the colleague and I, whilst driving, had got to a point where there was another little fire over the road, and we'd had to stop on the highway while the fireys were dealing with that fire. And we opened the car door and it was nearly ripped off by the wind. And, our little cocoon of air-conditioned comfort was completely breached. And in that moment, I just went, wow, this wind is going to drive whatever is out there that's alight. This is going to make furnaces. And then that was the moment I realized that, but that just kept escalating. And the standing at the bridge there I think we stood there for about 3 or 4 hours. Time gets all weird and compressed and stretchy when you're in situations like that. But over that time, I just remember the wind absolutely pulling at us and how hot it was, to the point where there was a moment where the fire was getting closer and closer to our house. We could hear gas cylinders in Tathra exploding. We'd seen carloads of people coming out, just car after car, so crammed, some of these vehicles, with people that they were all, squashed up against the windows and sitting on each other's laps and kind of pressed to the glass. And there were even 4-wheel drives towing open boats, and in the back of the boats there were people standing and kids and things. So
I suppose you would have been, that was fairly fortunate there was as late as March, because I would expect in the school holiday period, a bit earlier, you would have a greater population there in that area visiting.
Totally, but our caravan parks were pretty full, because it's our holiday season goes through till the weather gets cool. So we have another blast at Easter, whenever Easter falls. But yeah, my recollection is that there were a lot of people in the caravan parks, which is why there were a lot of cars towing, and that became a way to get people out, but a very dangerous way to travel, to have people standing the back of these boats. So there was a moment where all of that going on, and I thought, well, this is it. My house is about to go. I'm about to be a homeless person who's lost everything in a fire, which is not what I had planned for Wednesday, the 18th of March. So, your head's just clanging around with that. And I remember just walking out into the river, because it was so hot, and standing there with the water, up around my thighs, and saying a few kind of Buddhist prayers of letting my possessions go. Not very successfully, because I didn't want it to happen. I thought I'll at least try this. And then just as I finished, and maybe this is a sign of how effective it actually was, but just as I finished saying that, the big, one of the big water bombing aircraft came over and dropped, and it was the first time we'd seen the plane, and it dropped a load of water on part of the fire that was starting to wrap around our place, potentially saving our house. I'm not sure whether, there would have been a few other factors as well, but then that plane had to go off and spent the rest of the time dealing with the fire in Tathra. And it wasn't the end of the risk to our house by any stretch. That was where everything became like a war complete. The battleground had really just exploded. So that was the horror of seeing and knowing that other people were losing everything. It was weird. I didn't even think about the human beings, because I could see them coming out. So I had this protective thought going on that everyone was safe.
They're all going to safety.
Yeah, and it turns out that was very far from the truth. And there was a lot of people at huge risk. People had evacuated. When you showed that map, you can see, the curve of the beach that goes around, and at the end there's some cliffs. There's you can see where the hotel is there.
Yeah.
Yep, and that's quite a prominent cliff, and then the Tathra headland at the end goes down to the ocean. Now, people up there had thought they were quite safe, because you can see there's a lot of distance between them there and the forest behind, but the fire had cut straight through the centre of town and had reached that headland. So there were bits of the headland that were burnt right at the end there, and there were properties burnt right through Tathra to the ocean. So
it swept through this area more than up here?
Oh no, it hit pretty well everywhere. There were places right down the bottom of your map where it says Google, places burnt down there. There were places right up the top, the caravan park there, the eco camp, there were places that was burnt out completely as well. So it tore through the whole place.
No, there you go.
And I think in reflection, we were very lucky. Go on, Bill.
I was just wanting to sort of move on to the effectiveness of the fire service on that day, because it was called into question. Were you in the community across that, or because there was an inquiry, so was there information coming in from the community in response to the fires and the inquiry?
Look, it was a very difficult time because we're a rural area. We have an RFS, the Rural Fire Service, which is staffed by volunteers and headed up by paid professionals. I think that those people did an amazing job on the day of trying to protect community, and in the end, they we all succeeded in keeping ourselves safe, and the work that they did certainly kept people safe and kept properties, some properties from burning. And I have good friends who were part of those crews who went into town to fight those fires. But when you're a rural fire service, your training is about fighting fires in forests and in open areas, and a town fire is a very different thing because of the sort of gas bottles exploding and not knowing what the toxic things are that are burning in someone. You can imagine your carport going up, what's in there, your cans of paint and oil and stuff. So it's a very different beast when it's an urban fire. So that combination of the two things, I think, was a shock to everyone, because training doesn't necessarily cover for a rural fire service fighting that kind of an urban fire. There were definitely problems that happened on the day, and I remember being really shocked that I didn't get a text message or any warning at all until we were, the fire was all but over before I got the very first text saying, you need to take cover. It was kind of funny, but not funny at the time to get that text while everyone was clearly, there was a story about one man he lived in an underground flat, and he'd had a big night the night before. I think I might be telling this right. And he'd slept through the entire disaster and emerged at the end of it. Fortunately, not his, the house he was in, not burning, but him unaware of what had happened. And I'd sometimes reflect on that man's mental health, having left his room with a hangover, no doubt, and walked out into a world that would have seemed completely apocalyptic. But yeah, so there were definitely problems with communication from the fire services, and even the radio stations they were not prepared for this event. In our local radio station, there was only one person, I think, in the ABC office, and she wasn't prepared for a situation like this, and it was really hard circumstance for her to be dealing with. She had no backup at that point and wasn't sure what she was supposed to be doing. And I've worked in radio and I've worked alone in that circumstance, and I really don't blame any of those people for the problems that occurred. What I do fervently hope is that the learnings that came out of that, and they were significant, are acted upon and continued. Those systems continue to be perfected, because we're going to need them more and more frequently.
Well, I suppose your fire was a bit of small cheese compared to 2019. But if we can move to,
was a dry run.
If we can move to those fires, which really is the catalyst for you getting into this action in a real meaningful and in-depth way, maybe you can give us a bit of an overview. So, the fires are a long story, but if you just give us a bit of an overview of the events, the inquiry, and then maybe the push to get you to COP26.
Yeah, look, the inquiry was actually not a big part of how I got engaged with this. And all of that's out there in the public realm now. So I don't want to go too deeply into the inquiry itself. But for me, what occurred as a result of going through that was, I'd been aware of climate change for 15, 20 years at that stage. And increasingly, I'd been taking part in actions in my community about that. I knew it was a concern. I knew what the scientific, position on it was. And I also knew that if I stood up in council and talked about climate change, that I could expect to be kind of howled down or treated like I was some kind of crazy. That was the state of play at the time. But there was something very viscerally compulsory is the wrong word, but just this huge push I felt directly after the Tathra fire, that I understood now that I'd been wrong to think that climate was a future problem. It clearly was a right here and now problem, and that a fire out of season like ours, and then early in April, I remember taking a photograph of another temperature gauge in my partner's car, and it was 39 degrees 4 weeks after that fire. So it was mid-April, down on the far south coast, it was nearly 40 degrees. That is unheard of. And I just, that combination of things, I could not walk away from that understanding and the chance that I'd been given, because I didn't lose my home, but I'd watched all these other people lose absolutely everything. And suddenly that responsibility just overtook me, that if you see that and you understand that and you know why it happened, then you have to do something about it. And so I was pleased to see that there was an investigation into the fire, but that focused very much on and then this is an important distinction. A lot of those investigations focus on what caused the spark that ignites the fire. However, there will always be sparks that ignite fires. What is important is the conditions that precede the spark, because if the conditions are right, there will always be a spark. There will always be lightning strikes. There will always be a hot car exhaust. Yes, there are.
Always be an arsonist, a pyromaniac.
There will, but it turns out that's actually quite rare. And the data I've seen on the reasons for a lot of the fires starting in those dry periods, dry lightning strikes is the big one, and arson is a very small one. So, and in both cases, none of those fires would have taken off unless the conditions were catastrophic. And that's the important thing that I started to think about, was the sparks are different to the conditions. It's like you can set a really bad fire in a fireplace and you can throw as many matches at that as you want, and it will never ignite. But if we keep letting our environments get desiccated to the point they are because of the changes in the climate, then we're always going to face disasters. And every bit of science I've seen points to this being the problem going forwards.
The inquiry for the 2019-2020 summer, I mean, there was more than one, because there was Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland had major fires in central Queensland, and then there was an overall federal inquiry. So there was 3 separate inquiries. It's interesting in regards to, I think the New South Wales came out with 73 recommendations overall, which is a lot of recommendations. I mean, if it takes a fire to come up at this day and age, if it takes a fire to come up with 73 recommendations, what have you been doing for the last 20 years, you people? Now, you are supposedly experts, managers of the forest and that, and your shortcomings is emphasised by 73 recommendation. That's really an indictment of the standard of the people who have been operating either the fire service, the forest, or whatever, I mean, to come up with a few recommendations to clarify a few things, but 73 recommendations just in the New South Wales report was quite incredible. And the other one I find was there's a group called Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. I pulled up their report, or their submission, and the first major part of their submission was about climate. And to me, I read that climate part as trying to vindicate the people in charge, vindicate them from the actual management problem. And also, it seemed to point that regardless of the improvements we make, the climate change is going to negate a lot of that any improvements. So the focus is we have to fix climate change. So that was the first, I think that was chapter 3, and it was reasonably extensive. It was made up about an eighth of the report before they got into the nitty-gritty about pre-season burning and other management and that. So obviously it's something most people go to, and most of those submissions, I think there were 1,600 submissions for New South Wales. A lot of those submissions pointed to climate change as a factor. There were some pretty scathing ones in regards to forest management, locking up the land, failure to burns, the lack of access through to these forest areas. And I think one of the big problems was highlighted was if the fire starts in the middle of the forest, you've got to be prepared that it's going to come out of the forest and bite you. So you've got to have barriers between the deep forest and where people live in that. So they were some of the things that were thrown around in the conversation.
They were, Bill, and I know that the Royal Commission into the Black Summer 2019-20 fires came up with a very strong statement that relates to that. And the statement was about the fact that no amount of hazard reduction burning is going to protect us from these sort of fires. And one of the really terrible lessons that we relearned in our valley here was that during that fire season 2019, the fire that hit Cobargo, which was a similar kind of circumstance, right through the middle of a little country town, not coastal this time, but in dairy farming country. We're not talking about the Mallee, and that fire came across paddocks and dairy country. It didn't get its energy from dense forestry. It might have started and moved around through forest, but the fire that actually hit the town was coming out of pasture lands. And that's something that, again, for me has been a big wake up, because I live in a forested area, and that's my choice. And we've got a big clearing, and we're well versed on how we need to protect ourselves and when to get out. However, the big learnings that I've had are that it's not just about fire moving through forest, and fires in grassland move a lot faster than fires through forest. That's the other thing. So simply clearing big gaps between us and a forest is not going to be the savior that we might think. And the other thing that became really obvious to us in those dreadful New Year's fires was fires moving up through Victoria. And I don't know if people are aware of that landscape. The coastal border between Victoria and New South Wales is heavily forested, but it's largely state forest. So a lot of it had been logged in fairly recent history over the last 20 years, 10 years, and a lot of it was regrowth, and the regrowth hadn't been managed in ways that reduce the density of the tree. So, and again, regrowth is a huge issue both in after forestry and after fires, because it is dense, and the denser forest is what produces the really lethal heat balls and the desiccated environment that make the fires so hot and so ferocious. And that's what came across the border towards us from Victoria at the same time as we were getting fires like that from inland towards us. So that nearly took out Eden, the most southerly town in our shire. And the reason behind that was that the forests there hadn't been managed. And the other salient point there is even the national parks, there's been this stripping of resources out of national parks over the last 10, 15 years, so that staffing levels have dropped horrendously. And the parks who know what they need to do don't have the resources to do the sort of management that they traditionally have done, let alone the sort of practices that were originally for 50, 60,000 years done by the Indigenous owners of these landscapes and lands who were managing forests in a very different way to what we've done ever since we've settled.
I suppose the other thing is, really, we should have, we do get surprised by grass fires because of the speed and the intensity they move. And it's something that's been with us since settlement. Now, there was big fires in the 1890s in Victoria, and it basically was all pasture area, mainly sheep areas and wheat. And what happens the common thing with after they harvest, they just cut the wheat down and take the husk and the crown and leave the
stubble,
low cuttings there for the animals to graze on. But even we seem to be slow learners, because I travelled back from Cairns bound to Melbourne in 2013, and there was fires in central New South Wales near Dubbo and that area. And I remember hearing about a stud sheep farm, merino farm, wool farm, and losing its entire flock. And it was basically because they had their flock on land that had been cut, crop for hay and that. And although it's only small stubble, it's enough to kill sheep. They don't survive fires. They don't survive fires very well at all. So over that time, we're sort of, I don't know what we have learned and what we've put in place, but we don't seem to be able to safeguard ourselves, even with the long history that we've had. And grass fires, and another example, I suppose, recently in the United States, in Colorado, you couldn't find a tree anywhere in Colorado or anything like a forest, but you had plenty of grass plains. And that fire that burnt one of these townships near Denver, I think they lost about 1,100 homes. That was just a grass fire as well. But there was a problem there that came out later, is that they hadn't been doing fire reduction there, and there was just vast expanses of well-browned off fuel to bring that fire. And between wind and that fuel load, just got into the township. So
it's true, Bill, but the other really important point about those Colorado fires is we saw them being put out by snow. So we're seeing fires in winter, and the irony, and that happened in our shire the same year as our 2018 Tathra fire. We had a 7-week fire that burned in the national parks here throughout winter while there was snow on the mountains behind. So that is unheard of. This is the stuff that, freakish kind of, and we're seeing it again with the floods that we just have not seen in recorded history. And for all of those events to be happening within the same kind of 5 years period, it's an indication that we can expect a lot more extraordinary weather events to be hitting us from all kinds of directions as a direct result of the changes in the climate.
If we just move on now, there was fundraising for you to get. No?
We didn't get to COP yet.
No, well, that's what I'm coming to. There was fundraising in your area to send you to COP. I think there was, I read there was $12,000 raised to help you on your way. And so you got over there for that. Can you tell us a little bit about the fundraising and who sort of behind it, and then the trip itself, and how the event sort of unfolded as far as you experienced?
Yeah, sure. Look, I was a complete beginner to COP. It was a very last minute decision for me to go because I just didn't think that I warranted a ticket to COP. But there was still a few passes available in a couple of weeks lead up, and an email went around saying, "Is anyone, we've still got 4 opportunities. Is anyone up for this?" And I tentatively put my hand up, but first saying I would only go if there was value in having me there. And there was just this resounding yes from the people who were part of the group making the decision about who got those passes, but also from my community and my friends and the other people in the bushfire survivors supporter base saying, yes, we want your voice to go and speak at that. It's the world's biggest climate conference, and it's annual and it's urgent. So I gathered myself and took off. The borders were still closed, the borders of the country. It was quite a performance to try and get out because the pandemic had locked us in and no one was leaving. So I had to get special permission to leave the country. All the ducks got lined up appropriately, and I found myself in Glasgow all of a sudden at this conference that has up to 30,000 people, I think, over the 2 weeks. It's a 2-week long conference. It's massive. Basically, a whole city of people is built for each of those conferences. So it was a big sports arena and area with huge tents set up, linking all of the big venues. And every day I would trudge from my digs in Glasgow. Some lovely people, local Glaswegians, put me up for the 2 weeks, and I would tramp down there, go through it was harder than getting on an international flight to get into the conference every day, the levels of security. And then I would just front up and go to the Australian Pavilion and figure out what to do every day from scratch. But what I saw that was really quite confronting ultimately was that it became apparent that almost every other pavilion and every other country who were present at that COP not only got that climate change is an urgent and pressing issue, they got that they needed to be responding to it in real and meaningful ways by having really good goals for the reduction of emissions. But the Australian Pavilion was the complete opposite. And what I found was this big model of a Santos carbon capture and storage rig that fronted the whole pavilion. And Santos, of course, is a big coal seam gas and mining and exploration company. So it was a bit of a wake up, and it took me a couple of days to actually get my head around what that meant. But the Australian government clearly had a very different position on emissions reduction to what I saw the rest of the world grappling with.
Well, I suppose carbon capture is one of the cornerstones of carbon reduction. It's been around or talked about for several years now, talking about from gathering up artificially with these sort of reverse air conditioners, separating it and then pumping it back underground. Old oil wells and that are prime candidates for sending it down. So I suppose not justifying Santos, but the idea of a carbon capture machine is probably reasonable for the event. And I have seen a lot of videos where people are showing these actual machines that actually, you know, they do look like reverse air conditioners that just suck in normal air and separate it and shut off the carbon dioxide to one area. And then it's a matter of getting it from that storage to permanent underground storage.
All of this, unfortunately, is unproven. This is the problem with it, though, Bill. And that was, again, I feel a bit like I'm Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz, sometimes just wandering around naively, bumping into reality. And this was another one of those where I thought, well, that looks, reasonable. There's this big machine that captures the gas that is escaping, or the emissions that are escaping from the production of gas and stores it underground. That's a great theory, but in practice, it hasn't actually been proven. And when we're producing energy by doing that, and I'm talking about gas at this point, gas is such an expensive energy to use that to add the cost of the emissions capture, when you look at what you're trying to do, which is to provide an energy source, I just don't understand why we wouldn't be using a renewable source that you don't have to do any of that and is way cheaper. So who's buying this gas at the end of the day, and who's gonna fix things when that doesn't work, or if that doesn't work, or if the whole notion of storage fails at a future point, and then we've got yet another issue. And the other problem with that is it just encourages more investment into the same industries that are causing the emissions at the moment, that are causing the changes to the climate that we're all struggling to adapt to daily. So I could not find a rationale for that, and other than the investment that those companies have put into the technology and to those industries.
In regards to the COP, how did it sort of play out? Did did you sort of go there and then watch different speaking events on big screens, or did you attend any events where there were keynote speakers? I mean, the first part of it is basically world leaders turn up and they're there and gone within a day or so, really. I mean, they have to get back to business of running the countries. So did you attend any of those personally? And or were they sort of things that were available on screens everywhere around the venue?
No, look, apparently this was a very different COP because of COVID. And I'm going to say because of COVID, because you're never quite sure whether that was really the reason why things played out as they did. But you've got this huge number of people at a COP who are the leaders, as you said. So we did have Scott Morrison there briefly, who had to kind of be dragged kicking and screaming, but he did go in the end, and that was good. And then you've got the lower tier of representatives. So Angus Taylor was there at the Australian Pavilion for most of that period. And similar would be happening on most of the pavilions and the countries who are being represented. However, because of COVID, what would usually be the big room where all the leaders and the negotiators would be doing their work would usually either be available to us, who were the civil society observers, and that's what I was there as, or we would be in the overflow room looking at a big screen that showed you what was going on in the negotiating room. But that actually wasn't available. We didn't get to see the negotiations until the very last day or second couple of days, which it was a bit intriguing as to why that was not possible, and disappointing, because if this isn't transparent, then people are left wondering why we're cut out. And the other issue was even the Australian DFAT would usually offer briefings throughout the conference to civil society people like me, to keep us up to date, but we had to go searching for that. And we did get 2 briefings in the end, but we had to go and kind of beg and borrow to get them to happen. So it did feel like we were a bit cut out of the process, as opposed to the 500 lobbyists from the fossil fuel sector who were there at the same time, who amount to more participants than any single country had at that conference. So this is a conference about climate change, 500 fossil fuel lobbyists.
And they all had their company credit card, nice accommodation, business class travel, and all those sort of things that go with it. But
they weren't walking and riding a rusty bicycle like I was.
Yeah, other thing is too, in September, the IPCC AR6 assessment report came out. Was there any sort of people there presenting findings from that report? Because that's only the 6th report since COP's had 26 conferences. We've only just got up to our AR6, and I think this Working Group 2's report only came out last Monday. So was there any scientific sort of discussions or information put up or presented?
There would have been. The COP is I mean, it's not a single event. So throughout the COP, that you've got a picture, there's about, I don't know, 70 or 100 pavilions representing different nations, and they've all got things going on for a lot of the time, and having completely different kinds of presentations as well. So in some of those pavilions, there would have been some stuff about the science of climate. But what was really obvious to me was that most nations have moved well beyond needing to talk about the science of climate. They're talking about the solutions and the impacts. And this COP particularly was one where the shift of focus is turning from what climate change is and what climate change will mean for economies, to what climate change is actually doing to human beings. So what effects it's having on communities and societies, and on people in the global south, in developing countries, and people in the global north, developed countries. and all being impacted by different aspects. So there was a lot more of that than there was about the science. So the IPCC report wouldn't have been necessarily as prevalent in those presentations.
Well, I think like Christine Lagarde, she's now the president of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and she was a former finance minister in France. She actually said, well, the work of Working Group 1, which is the scientific, looking at CO2 and all that sort of stuff, their work is done and they basically can afford to pack up their bags. And what we're looking now at, what we've got to do, this is the theory, now this is what we have to do, and that's Working Group 2, and that's the report. That's to deal with mitigation issues, things in regards to, well, your sea level planning, like town planning or shore planning, protections and all those sort of things. That's what Working Group 2 is involved in. So she obviously concurs with what you're saying. We've got to move on from just talking about the theory to actions. And she obviously, and that's the first time I've ever heard someone of that prominence who has been behind the climate change movement for some time to actually say that, to say, well, this stage is over and now we're here. So that's quite interesting, because that changed the dynamics from grants to sort of scientific like universities and that, and let them do research, to really moving the money to sort of, well, engineering and building and infrastructure and all those sort of things. So, and also, of course, renewable energy projects. So it is a big shift from the academic side of it to the doing people. So that's going to be an interesting challenge for academics in regards to realise that, well, they need now to accept that the action is now in the people who put shovels in ground and all that sort of thing. So that's an interesting thing.
It's also really, it was obvious over there that even the people on the street in Glasgow, and I remember and this was in Edinburgh actually, my first morning there, got out of the place I'd stayed overnight with this new friend I'd met who'd said, come and stay this one night with me. And she and I went out into the street to get a taxi to get to the train station to get to Glasgow. And there's a taxi with some bloke changing a tire. And we thought, oh, we'll get this cab when he's finished. So we get into a chat, and straight away, he starts pointing up to the gutters on these old buildings all around us, and sort of prompted a little bit to talk about climate, but just started saying his son's a plumber. He said, it's obvious to everyone here that the drains that have been on these buildings for hundreds of years now are not up to taking the rainfall that we're getting now because of climate change. This is a plumber's dad in Edinburgh. He's across the whole thing. And that was repeated again and again and again, that your average citizens and then I went after the COP, I went around Scotland a bit more, and then I went to Portugal, and the same thing was happening in Portugal. People got it. They've moved on from what Australia's. We are literally stuck 10, 15 years behind the rest of the world in these conversations. They're talking about the stuff they need to do, whereas we're still debating whether there's even climate change. Or up till recently, you couldn't say the words without someone chucking a brick at your head. So, it's kind of heartening to me to have seen how far ahead the rest of the world is.
I don't know. I think, the climate change people do get a good run in the media and stuff. If anything, it's the people on the other side of the debate who you don't really get an airing. So we can agree or disagree on that. But now the result was, for Australia, Scott Morrison basically has committed us to net zero 2050. I don't know, and the indications are, because he only went to that conference, supposedly dragged there kicking and screaming. But I was amazed how quickly the Commonwealth government has come out with these whole series of ads in regards to what we're doing to reduce emissions. We're having hydrogen hubs, we're doing this. I mean, but my concern of it is such a higgledy-piggledy approach. It's sort of, we've got to do a bit of this and we're going to do a bit of that. and we've got no idea if anything's going to work, but we're going to be seen to do something. So, and the other thing is we've got no idea of the cost, got no idea whatsoever. So that's a bit of a problem. Going forward, what are the things that you would sort of like to see in regards to net zero 2050 as sort of things that should get a lead versus things would be secondary going forward?
Yeah, look, the first thing I would say, Bill, is that the current information coming out of the federal government is inaccurate. That's a fact. So the way that emissions are being accounted is not accurate. It's underestimating wildly. You talk to any of the state governments, they're doing a way better job. And my hat is off to New South Wales state government, Victorian state government. I don't know much about what Queensland's doing, but I'm seeing state governments absolutely roar ahead and do the right thing. They're not just talking the talk, they understand what the issues are. They're way more connected to their communities and they're getting on with it. The federal government is still pretending that we're doing a good job on emissions when we're not. And that's, the whole world was watching us at COP and knew that. So it was kind of embarrassing in many ways to be an Australian there and hear what our government was telling the world at the same time as the real accounting figures were being released and were in reports, and that stuff has to improve. The other thing, obviously, is that a 2050 goal is a bit like saying to your 30-year-old daughter, you've got to start putting your money in superannuation, because when you retire at 69, you'll need a lot of super. And them saying to you, yeah, when I'm 68, I'm just going to do the whole thing then. It doesn't work like that. So we need a 2030 goal, and then we need to work the practical steps towards that. Like anyone who's doing long-term planning knows that you've got to have more than just a very distant goal. So yeah, I want to see the federal government start being a bit more realistic and working a bit better with the state governments on the sort of planning for the transition to renewables.
Going forward, even if we do get to net zero 2050, it's a long time off, and by then we're now at about 420 parts per million, rising between 1.5 and 2 parts per million every year. Now, doesn't matter what we do at the moment or the world does, that's got to continue to rise for a while. So if carbon dioxide is the trigger in that, and we've got to deal with more of it coming on, in regards to bushfires, right, we want to get the carbon emissions down, but between now and then, we still have to deal that we're going to have levels approaching 450 towards 500 before it ever tapers off. In bushfire management, and for your people in those regional areas that are faced with, surely you can't sit around and say, well, things will be solved when the CO2 is solved. What's the practical management and what's the practical message to government to protect towns and business and life and property and even wildlife in our forests going forward? Because regardless of 2050, CO2 is going to keep rising. So it's not going to magically stop the conditions that are occurring at the moment. We have to have some answers in regards to protections of our communities now and in the next short term.
Yeah, so a couple of things, Bill. And the first thing I'd say is there was some really, there's the usual sobering news came with the latest working group report, the IPCC working group report too. And that was about things are getting worse, and that all of the things they'd predicted were indeed happening. So that was the sobering bit. The really good news, that often this stuff it's not so tantalizing for the media, so it doesn't get out there. But the really good news that I took to heart was that they said there is a clear link between the reduction of emissions now and the reduction of bushfire risk, and that work we do in the next 10 years on emissions is going to have a measurable impact in reducing the bushfire risk in that same period. So that changed what I was thinking about that rise in the...
Oh, I'd like to see the science on that, because
Well, it's all there in the report.
yeah, but I'll talk
Have a
to
look,
Emma
'cause
Harrigan on
the-
that, because
the other side of that, Bill, was that they did acknowledge that there are other slower, like they said, the factors which impact bushfire are ones that are quicker to turn than the factors which impact on things like sea level rise. So we would still be facing a long, slow sea level rise, even if we do our best in the next 10 years. But by doing our best in the next 10 years, we would see a reduction in the bushfire risk. So that's my first point. That's why I think that it is important to keep focused on emissions at the same time that we do. Also, we are going to have to do incredible things to keep communities safer. And that's going to mean, you know, we've seen what's happening with the floods, the number of people who are homeless now as a result of numerous seasons of bushfires and floods is through the roof. So just getting all of those people housed is going to be the biggest issue for all levels of government for the next 5 years. And where those houses go and how they're constructed to be safer from those events, and even taking into account heat, not just fires, but heat. The conditions which make bushfires so dangerous are in themselves killing people already. So heat impacts in the cities and in regional areas where people are living in houses that don't have air conditioning, or, you know, there've been seasons where the air conditioning just can't keep up with the heat. So that's causing a lot of health damage and deaths already. So we need homes that are keeping people passively cooler, that are provide more protection from smoke, because we know that smoke killed around 470 people, I think, over that same period. So way more people were killed by the heat and the smoke during that Black Summer period. So I think that's going to be critical. The saddest thing is to hear also in that report repeated the warning that if we don't bring the CO2 emissions down, that the increase in the ferocity of those fires means they are not things that we can adapt to or prevent. And that was just a bold statement of, there's not much point trying to develop community fire response teams that you can't put in front of those fires because they're just too big and too ferocious. So it'll be perfecting evacuation systems and you know, the sort of bunkers and stuff that nobody likes to talk about, but that might be the only practical things that we can do in some circumstances. But forestry needs to improve, and there is a lot of gains to be had by managing those landscapes in ways that make them more.
Can we go back to logging some?
Well, logging alone
Please?
does not work. That was in the
No.
Royal Commission. I'm not just talking off my top of my head here. They found that the logged areas burned hotter and faster and were more dangerous. So if we're going,
I think that's because of regrowth that's sort of there.
That's part of logging.
There's
So
a lot more management than that. But
yeah.
As a former councillor, do you see a role, more importantly, a role for our planning systems and our authorities in planning to actually either keep us out of the gum forests in particular, or put in certain standards of that for buildings to protect us? And also, like in people facing floods, I mean, gee, you know, we've been living on floodplains all this time. We should have learnt to sort of, you know, build levees and deal with it. So you think there's got to be a bigger role and a more important role by planning authorities to ensure, and it maybe even stop people from, you know, putting themselves in these positions of danger, or in the sort of high forested areas or on the floodplains for the floods.
You'd think so. And look, this is the logic that I sat with for a long time before I went deep into this situation. And this is where it lands with me. I was in Melbourne at the start of the Black Summer fires at my dad's place in Eltham, where I grew up. It's suburban. that there's hundreds of thousands of people living in ordinary homes around my dad's place. And we had a few friends over on that New Year's Eve that we were, they were having a few champagnes and relaxing. I was just glued to my phone thinking, is this the second time I'm going to watch, flames come for my home? And then a friend said to me, well, at least you're here, Joe, you're much safer here than you would be at home. And I took a beat before I answered. And I said, actually, at home, even though I live in a forest, my partner is there. He's got fire pumps. We've got static water supplies. We've got a plan. We've got a house which we've cleared the vegetation, to a safe distance from the house. We've got an exit road in both directions. We've only got 6 neighbours. So even if we're all on the road at the same time, we'll get out. We've got water at the bottom of the property. We're aware of the risks and we know how to get out or defend ourselves. And we know exactly what resources we've got. And we're on off-grid power. So we're not going to lose power unless we lose it right here at this property. At Dad's place, however, amongst the gum trees in the middle of the suburbs, if there was a fire there, and there will be one day, where's everyone going? Where's the water coming from? We're not really awake to the real risks that we're looking at the moment, because it's not just about living amongst the gum trees out in the bush. People in the bush are actually taking much more care and doing as much as they can to stay safe. And the planning laws are only going to protect us so far, because people do have to live somewhere. And at the moment, and I've spent some bloody long dark nights thinking about where that safer place might be for me to run to. Doesn't exist. I need to deal with the environment as it is. And that means taking personal responsibility and then making sure that I mitigate those risks. And that's partly the work that I do on climate.
Well, being familiar with Melbourne itself, I mean, surely you must have also, like myself, wondered about the Dandenongs and the people up there and the roads. Like, if you go up to places like Sassafras and Monbulk and that, it's narrow roads, and there's a lot of houses in there. And if there was a fire up there in about 94 or something like that. I think 3 people lost their lives, but it was fairly contained. But I just dread the day that there's a substantial fire in the Dandenongs, because those people, there is no way the number of people who live up there, and if it happened during one of those days when there's a lot of, like a Sunday or something, when there's a lot of visitors up in that area, it would be an absolutely disaster, because I think there would be just burnout cars along every stretch of road if you ever got a real. So I don't know. I think there's all these places are time bombs, and as you say, in regards to your concerns about climate change and that clock is ticking, and we don't seem to really be appreciated the dangers that these people have put themselves in. And I don't know how we're going to extricate those people from that danger going forward.
I think conversations like this is the biggest thing we can do, Bill. And look, I'm heartened by observing the shift just in the 3 years since the fire that woke me up to, hate to use the word woke because everyone's going to call me woke now, but it woke me up to what was really going on. And I've seen such a big shift in Australia during that period. And then having that opportunity to go to Glasgow, seeing what the rest of the world was talking about, reassured me that we are, as soon as we step into that space, the rest of the world's doing a huge amount about climate change. Australia needs to catch up a bit. And given the risks that we're at and the opportunities we've got, and I was just on the radio on the way in listening to Radio National, and they were talking about the Commonwealth Bank, Qantas, and the Macquarie Group, pretty big players in the Australian economy, all getting together and talking about how they are starting to plan. Their forward planning includes provision for carbon taxes. They're putting it in because they want it. Not because also because they know they're going to have to deal with the costs of it, but they're planning for it because it's so important.
Well, I can understand Macquarie Bank because they're the ones who'd be selling the credits and getting the commissions, but the people down the end like you and me are the ones who are going to be paying. So some people might think that's a great thing, and other people think, well, you know, we're the ones who are always going to be stuck with the bills and not appreciate it.
Kind of stuck with the bills already, though, Bill. That, you know, if you look at the cost of the floods and the fires, it's far more than what we would have to pay.
The insurance are going to get us now, but
if you can get insurance, that's the problem.
That's it, yeah. Look, we've gone over the hour and a quarter, actually. Look, it's been a great evening. I hope you enjoy it. You're welcome to come back at any other time in regards to if you've got a further story or another development. Please get in touch. Hopefully I can get the people from climate change. I've been haranguing Emma Harrigan for almost 3 months now to get someone to come on and talk about AR6. I've got some people lined up to talk about renewable energy like hydrogen, and also 2050, going ahead with 2050 planning and that. But I really wanted to do the AR6 before I got around to you, but that didn't happen. So I'll keep pestering Emma. Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. And as I say, if there's anyone within your group or got another story or another focus like renewables or something that's going on in an area, you're welcome to give us a call and fetch in for a show. But I hope you enjoyed tonight.
Oh, it was great to have a robust chat about this, Bill, because yeah, I think we need to flesh this out, and we need to hear each other out and share this information, and you know, and it's a positive story too. That's the other thing. It's great to have the opportunity to talk about what we are doing and can do, and how Australian communities are finding their way through this and doing it, you know, stepping up in times of disaster, like we're seeing yet again in Lismore and all those other places that are suffering at the moment. So hats off to everyone who's pitching in and helping out, and a huge hats off to you, Bill, for running this show and doing such a good job holding these conversations, because I think they're really going to be important in the future. And I'll go and see if I can wrangle some more people to talk to in my area.
Thanks very much. Yeah. If you just stay on the line, I'll just wind up the show and introduce next week's guest.
Beauty.
And thanks again. If you enjoy the shows, please like, subscribe, and follow our Facebook page, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, we'll have part 2 of nuclear power with Professor Dr. Mark Ho. And then in this case, he'll be talking about advancements in nuclear power and its ability and our ability to bring it online much quicker than the old systems, especially the modular type power units. Also, a little bit of discussion about thorium and the pebble reactors. So the new generation of reactors are out there, which are also carbon free. We should please the climate situation. So join me again next week when my guest is Dr. Mark Ho. Good evening.